If we enjoy drawing buildings and streets, then streetscapes are a great subject for panoramic drawings, for longer stretched out formats. And this late afternoon autumn scene in a New South Wales country town, I thought was a great subject to tackle in a wider, more stretched view. And I particularly wanted to be able to capture the light effect. So right from the start, I was planning to use my Copic sketch markers to add some tone, some value. And if you'd like to have a go doing this and maybe even want to just start with adding the values, I'm going to post on my channel community page the line drawing as well as the reference photo. So I took a photo before I added the tone. That's my little present to you. You don't have to do the 50 minutes of drawing that the line drawing was. So you're watching this at 4 times my drawing speed. So I probably didn't start this in the most helpful way. A scene such as this, I would normally start approximately in the middle with whatever object gave me the most chance of doing something that's accurate from a proportion and scale point of view. But I started with the tree because it was sort of in the middle of the view of the house, which is central to the scene. And so I had to get the tree done, and then I did the close building to the right of that. But I probably should have just drawn the building, the tree, and then branched out in each direction, left and right and down. I think that would have been a more satisfactory way to do it. And I think I would have been a little more accurate than I finished up being. Now, I'm drawing the tree and the closest building on the right there with a 0.3mm pen. I'm using a 0.2mm pen for the other tree, and for the building that's behind the first tree, the darker building. And then I'm switching to a 0.1mm pen for the buildings further back along that street, which are more in the sun and lighter. And I use a 0.5 for that part of a stone fence to the left. And the idea is that the heavier lines come forward and the lighter lines move backwards. It also means that as we move backwards in a scene such as this, a lot more lines end up being closer together because of foreshortening. And so using a lighter line width can stop our scenes actually looking darker and more inky as they get further away, which is the exact opposite of the visual effect in life. So we don't want that. I'm trying to see this building, this corner building, which is fairly complex, as a series of shapes and boxes, and to keep what I'm drawing in proportion to what I've already drawn. Again, working out where the pitch of the roof is, where the apex of that rooftop is in relation to what's underneath, firstly on my reference and then in the drawing. And we can use our pen to measure angles that aren't necessarily perspective angles, although you'll see me do that for a few of the perspective angles as well. The challenge with a view such as this is to capture the sense of the street moving along back into the distance and getting the slight angle correct there. That angle does slide up slightly. I'm relatively high compared to my view, so eye level is relatively high. So lines on the bottom half of the page tend to angle up, and lines on the top half of the page tend to angle down, meeting somewhere on the left-hand center of the paper. So adding some hatching for these tall, dark pines, more just to make the building in front of them look clearer. As I said, I am intending to use ink over the top of my lines so that that does impact the line work that I do at times, but at other times I still like to do some hatching even though I'm going to come over the top, because I feel like it integrates those areas into the rest of the drawing slightly. Plus it does let me get a darker effect. And so now with my 0.2 doing the other tree and trying to align the top and the base of that tree with the one I've already drawn, as I say, first in the reference and then in my drawing. Now, one of the perhaps easy things to do that we don't want to do drawing a scene such as this is to slowly do everything just a little bit too wide as we move down the street, and therefore we extend too far across to the left and we end up with not enough space to put the detail that we want to put in. You'll notice that I stopped to do street things, street furniture such as these lights that are in front of the buildings I'm drawing before I try and draw the buildings before. And I often leave just a very slight gap between the lines of what's behind things such as these poles and the lines of the buildings that I'm drawing behind them, just to give a bit of visual buffer, create almost a halo effect so that it's easier to see what's what, but also it helps the closer item to feel closer, to sit more in the foreground compared to what's behind it. And all of that gives us a sense of 3 dimensions, which is what we want in a panoramic view, and particularly one which stretches back into the distance. We want to use whatever techniques we have, whatever devices we have, to give the feel that it's going backwards. And particularly in a scene such as this, where as the buildings go backwards, they're in more light, and the effect is becoming more pale and less distinct. And so I want to try and capture that by the end of my drawing. But I'm very much aware that I'm going to be putting the ink value over the top as well. So at this point, I'm trying to simplify my lines. I'm using the 0.1 millimeter pen now. I'm trying not to do too much detail. Always a problem or a challenge in a scene such as this from a photo, in that we can see so much more detail than we really want to draw, because if we try and draw it, it's going to make this distant object look heavy-handed and not quite as distant. So learning to simplify, even though we could put the detail in, is a bit of self-control that it's very helpful to develop. And so now I'm adding the final street light, and again I'm aligning it with the one I've already drawn and having a quick look at the perspective angles that the tips of the two lights establish and the bends, because they're horizontally on the same plane and therefore they follow the perspective angle of the scene. So a bit of decorative flourish at the tops of these buildings further along the street. This is where we start to see just how precise have we been when we start to connect things we drew just at the end of the drawing to things that we drew in another part of the page, other part of the paper at the start. I'm not too far out there with that roof line going along, so I'm happy enough with that. And now I've got my 0.5 and I'm doing this very close gatepost of the town cathedral, of the region's cathedral, and just that bunch of foliage on top, and then there's just the railing coming off the fence, and then we're just about ready to add the marker to it. As I said, this took me about 50 minutes, maybe just a couple of minutes less in real time. And there's a couple of cars there that I realise I want to put in, need to put in as well. So I'm trying to line the cars up with what's happening in the reference across the road and find the same place and try and keep the scale correct. As you might know, cars are not my easiest subject, but therefore they're a good practice for carefully observing what we see and drawing it. And now I can finish that last little bit of building between the church fence on the left and the street, particularly drawing that last bit with a very light and indistinct touch. Now just doing the fence and the metal mesh that's there. And I decide to also add some lines to help guide me with the shadows that go across the road, because these shadows, I think, are a very important part of the light effect and of indicating that this is late afternoon. It wasn't that late really, but the sun's setting earlier in the day. Just checking for any more details, and then we're done. You can get this off my community page, screenshot it, print it, and start at this next stage. So I'm using the brush end of my Copic sketch markers, the neutral grey colour. I'm going to use the N0, N1, N2, N3, N4, and that's it. I didn't use N5. So the darkest values that you've just seen me place are N4, and they really establish the values that we're going to use in the rest of the scene, because I want those to be the darkest ones that we have. I'm using an N2 for this wall that's well shaded. It's a lightish coloured wall. I don't want my values to be too dark in this further part of the street, because part of the way we get an effect of distance, of depth, is to lighten our values as they move further back. Now that tree that I've just done is closer, and so therefore I've used a noticeably darker value and a much darker value again for the tree that's closer. And I decided to go with some values across the road sooner rather than later, because they are very important to the overall feel of the scene, but also to the establishing of a sense of depth. And so I don't want to be adding them later, because the thing about values are we read them, we understand them in relation to other values. So whether something looks light or dark depends on what's around it. If there's lighter values around a certain value, then it will look dark. But if we put darker values around that same value, it's going to look lighter. So we don't want to go too heavy, too hard, unless we're very confident, because we obviously can't take the ink off the page. And we're using value both for shade and shadow, but also for local colour, for the simple colour that an object is, or at least they're the possibilities we have for using it. And so I'm going lighter at this point in the distance, and even in the foreground, I end up, that closest house, I end up darkening the values of the side of that house that's facing us right at the very end. And I think it was the right choice to make. But I did that at the end because I wasn't sure whether it was going to be too dark. So I use N3 for most of the drawing, and then at the end I add N4 to darken the right-hand side of that side street of that darker brick building. So these values took me 20 minutes in real time to put on. So you're also watching those at 4 times drawing speed. But I think it's a nice medium to use, especially if we can get to do this sort of thing on location, because they're easy to transport. We actually don't need many if we're happy to apply value and colour in monochrome. So half a dozen of these are all we need, or even say 4, to get a nice range of values that we can go from light to dark in. So there is a lot of doing it now and sitting back and looking at it and working out, is that reading correctly, or have I gone a bit dark here and therefore I need to darken some other things to keep the relative values the same? That's a really important skill to develop, to learn to perhaps go a bit light and then check, recheck, make adjustments. But particularly in a drawing this scale, it just takes literally moments to adjust something. And so it's not as if it's an onerous thing or that we're really doubling up on the work. It just literally takes minutes and can really transform our drawing, can really make the overall effect at the end pop out. And particularly when we have a long, thin format, it's quite nice to play with the values going from one end to the other. And we're done. I hope you go to the community page and at least print off the line drawing and have a go just adding the value. But why not try and draw the whole scene? I'll put both on my community page. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. This was a lot of fun for me to do something a bit different. I hope you give it a go. But look, whatever you draw, however you draw it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.